Name is Peter McCracken. I live in Ithaca, New York, upstate New York, about 4 hours from New York City, maybe a little bit more. And I am the publisher and sort of the sole body behind shipindex.org. I have a number of people that help me, but it is primarily my project. I was born in Seattle. I grew up in Seattle, so I was always around the water, and that was something that I always enjoyed, and a little bit of sailing, and some not a lot of sailing or anything, but it was something that I certainly did enjoy. I went to college in Ohio at Oberlin College, and just before I finished graduating, I learned about the Williams College Mystic Seaport Program in American Maritime Studies, which is an undergraduate program run by Williams College, but based at Mystic Seaport, which focuses on maritime history, marine science, literature of the sea, policy, things like that. And I was really excited about that. And so, because I hadn't completed all of my requirements for graduation, I was able to delay graduating from college for a semester. And I did that program at Mystic Seaport, and I found it really important, interesting, very meaningful to me. And I just found maritime history, the idea of how people moved by sea, is something that's really quite interesting. It's something that I wanted to continue exploring. When that was over, I moved back to Seattle, and I lived in Seattle for a year. And I had intended to try to go back to the seaport and work there, and I had to delay that for a year. But then I did go, and I worked at Mystic Seaport, and I decided that I wanted to go to library school. That was really what I wanted to do. While I was working at the seaport, I decided that I'd go to the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. They had a great library school, they still do. And somebody I was working with there told me that UNC also had a big program in maritime history, a master's program in maritime history, which I found really interesting and intriguing. So I guess it was 1993, I suppose. I drove down from finishing my time at the seaport and went to Chapel Hill. And after I got myself settled there and started taking my library science classes, I asked some questions in the history department about this maritime program. And I learned that it was not at UNC Chapel Hill, but instead at East Carolina University. It was founded by Bill Still, who just passed away not too long ago. I think that's worth noting. And anyway, it was a great program. It is a great program that they created there. So I finished my master's program in library science. It was a 2-year program, and I should say I spent the summer of that program working at the Maine Maritime Museum, and it was there that I got the first ideas of what would become Ship Index. But I came back, I finished my library degree, and then I went to East Carolina, and I started a master's program there in maritime history. And at the same time, I got my first job as a reference librarian working in Joyner Library at East Carolina University. After a little bit of that time, I was ready to find a new place to work, and I applied for and was offered a position at the University of Washington, which was great. I got to go back home where my whole family was, and my then girlfriend, now wife, moved with me back to, no, we were married at the time. By then we were married. We moved to Seattle in 1999. And in 2000, I started a company with my brothers and a high school friend that helps libraries manage their electronic resources. It solved a problem that we identified at the time. It was really quite successful, and so in 2002 I left the University of Washington and we went full time at this company. We were acquired by a larger company called ProQuest in 2004, and then in 2007. My wife took a position on the faculty at Ithaca College, and so we moved across the country, and we moved here to Ithaca, New York. In 2009, as I like to say, I decided I cared more about maritime history than I do about e-journal access and management, and I left that company. I left ProQuest, and I started shipindex.org. Now, ShipIndex actually was based on something that I had started at the University of Washington. And as I mentioned, it dated back to my experience in at Maine Maritime Museum. When I was working at the Maine Maritime Museum, I would be working on these records about the Sewell ships of steel that were built there at the Percy and Small shipyard. And if I wanted to do a little bit of research about those vessels, I'd have to go book by book in the library's collection to see which books mentioned those specific vessels. And not anyone could do that because at the time it was a closed SAC collection. So I could go book by book, but visitors to the museum's library couldn't do that. And of course, it was a nice museum, nice library, but it didn't have everything. There's all kinds of other books that were not in the collection. And I started thinking, boy, wouldn't it be useful to have some way of finding out which books mention specific vessels? And at East Carolina, I had a similar experience because I was working on well, it was when I was a graduate student. I was working in the rare books and manuscript collection, and I was transcribing a journal about these two guys who walked from Alabama down to New Orleans in the winter of 1819, I think it was. And in the spring of 1820, one of them took the General Butler back up to back home from New Orleans. Thought, how can I learn about this vessel, the General Butler? And there's really no way to do that. So when I was at the University of Washington in 1999 and 2000, I scanned in the indexes to books that mentioned a lot of ships. Started with McCurdy's Marine History of the Pacific Northwest, for example, which has got tons and tons of vessels mentioned in it, or Merchant Sail. Can't remember the author of the Merchant Sail. That's a 7-volume set, I think, where the 7th volume is an index to the other 6 volumes. And the guy who wrote it is mostly about New England and Maine shipbuilding, and he just mailed it to libraries around the country. He published it himself and mailed it, as I understand it. So these are really neat resources and really extensive. And so anyway, I scanned in the indexes to those books, and I did OCR, the optical character recognition, to convert it to text. And when I was sitting at the reference desk waiting for someone to come up with a question, I would work through those and correct errors and fix it. And I turned it into it started as a series of a dozen static web pages. And then over time it grew. And when it came time for me to leave the University of Washington, I had to take that with me because it was on web pages that were managed by the university. And so the database guy at the company that we had founded made a little database for me. I made a website called shipindex.org, and because I didn't have any intention of making it a commercial thing. And then when in 2009, I decided that I did want to make it a commercial thing. Of course, someone had taken shipindex.com, and I'll never get that URL. But that's how I created the database itself. And all the content that I have added in the last, since 2009, has gone into the full subscription database, and everything that predated the work in 2009 is freely available and will always be freely available. It's a bit of a long answer. I hope I didn't go too far, but that's an overview of how I got to where I am now with ShipIndex. Shipindex.org is a database that tells you what books, websites, magazines, databases, journals, whatever, mention the vessels that you want to know more about. It covers any named vessel that is in a resource in English. So I've often said it goes from the Solomenia, the Athenian ship of state during the age of Socrates, to the Costa Concordia and anything in between. And so if the book or the website is in English, then I will take the index and I'll put all the content in there. And it's primarily, and its goal is to have real vessels, but there are, the Argo, Jason's Argo is in there, and other sort of somewhat perhaps fictional book vessels are in there as well. There are sort of two aspects to the database. There's about 150,000 citations that are completely freely available without any sort of reservation or registration required at all. I'm not interested in collecting personal information about people at all. only what's needed to make stuff work, and none is needed to look at the, say, 150, 160,000 citations that are in there. So that's all the books that I had scanned the index to before I created it as a company, plus subject headings from WorldCat. And that's a really an interesting bit that's worth exploring a bit more about what these subject headings are and how they can be useful. Anything that I added to the database after the time that we turned it into an actual business goes into the full subscription database. Right now, it's got almost 3.2 million citations in it from over 1,000 resources. So these are almost all of the volumes that have been published by the Navy Records Society, which is they've been publishing primary documents in British naval history for maybe 140 years now. It could be any book that is about maritime history from anywhere in the world. There is, of course, a focus on Anglo-American history because that's what is the easiest to get a hold of. But I live about 1.5 miles and work at one of the largest academic libraries in the country. And so I have access to their great collection there and all of the, especially their Asian collection. And I also make trips to other libraries to get other books. Whenever I learn about a book, I put it in this great big document that I have. And sometimes they can request that the books be sent to me from other libraries. Sometimes I collect them. I've gone on collecting trips to the British Library, to the National Maritime Museum, to the Library of Congress, the National Library of Scotland, anywhere I can find. So the book itself needs to be in English, or the database has to be in English, or maybe there's a little bit of flexibility there. There's some Dutch databases where you can change it to English, and so I've added that content as well. So the resource basically is in English, but then it's any named vessel that is in those resources. I am always looking for new content to add. I have a team who's always working on content, and they're adding, I'd say they're adding a new resource every day or every other day as they work through these indexes that I've collected. The primary focus of shipindex.org is to make maritime history research easier to do. In a sense, I've started with trying to make research about vessels easier to do. And the reason that I do that is because I think that maritime history is so important to American history and to world history, and it's something that's not studied a lot. There are only 2 master's programs in the United States that focus specifically on maritime history. And so I'm trying to make it easier for people to learn about these ships. I would say that my primary focus is maritime historians. However, the people who use the database can vary quite a lot. And I know that I have a lot of genealogists who use the database, and there are all kinds of great ways that genealogists can use this database. If you know the name of a vessel that an ancestor emigrated on, or you know the name of a vessel that an ancestor served on in the military or worked on, or maybe the name of a vessel that so your great-grandparents went on a honeymoon on, say, you can learn more about those ships. And genealogists have this phrase where they talk about adding leaves to the tree, which I really like. And genealogy is absolutely primarily about the people and understanding the people and knowing who your ancestors are. But a great way to add leaves to that tree is to have more information about what their experiences were like. So if you can add a picture of the cruise ship that your grandparents or great-grandparents took their honeymoon voyage on, that's really cool. But more importantly, I think most people would agree, if you know the names of the vessels that an ancestor served on in the Navy or in another branch of the military, but you don't know what happened to them, you can use ShipIndex to learn a history of each of those ships and find out what happened to that vessel when they were on board. And even if the book that you find that talks about the history of the ship never mentions your ancestor, you already know that they were on board. So you can extrapolate. You could say, this is what happened to them. And what can be even more amazing in my view, and it's absolutely a much longer shot, is the idea that maybe you could find a a journal kept by a passenger who is on the voyage that your ancestor emigrated on, for example. So one set of resources that is in the free part of the database is subject headings from WorldCat. Now, worldcat.org is this massive bibliographic database that tells you which libraries own which books. It also includes a lot of manuscripts from what's called NUCMUC, the National Union Catalog of Manuscript Collections. This is US focused. NUCMUC is US focused, but WorldCat is really worldwide and in many different languages. But if you know that an ancestor traveled on a particular vessel, you could use Ship Index to see if there are any entries in WorldCat about that ship. And the entries are resources that are either by or about that ship. You say, a book by a ship? Well, this could be for naval folks, for example, it could be the cruise log, not the logbook, the cruise voyage book. They had essentially yearbooks from cruises. So you can find you can find an image of your ancestor who was on board that at a particular time, or you might find, the handwritten narrative by someone who was on board that voyage. And again, they may not mention your ancestor, but you have already established that your ancestor was on board at that time. I mean, if you were able to do that, this is a pretty long shot, but if it happened, boy, it would be incredible. And then what if in the journal they actually do mention your ancestor? I mean, that would be pretty wild. And I don't think that there's any way that someone would find that information without knowing where to go, and I think using Ship Index to get there. That part, the directory to resources in WorldCat, is in the completely free part of the database. And I should say that there is some really tricky stuff on searching for those manuscripts. You find something and it will tell you in WorldCat that the location can't be found. And I don't know why they don't fix this, why this isn't the way, but I have a blog entry about how to figure this out and how to find out where this logbook really is, because it is absolutely doable. It's just hard to know how to do it. And it's one of those things you just have to know how the tricks to get around it. But boy, if you can find one of those things, I think it would just be kind of life-changing in putting together this kind of story that of your ancestors. Lots of other people can find other reasons to look for vessels and learn more about them. Say city planners might need to, or the state historic preservation officers might want to know more about the vessels that might have been in their waters. Actually, someone from the Washington State Ferries, I think it was, or the Washington State Department of Transportation subscribed to the database because they were trying to figure out where an anchor that they recovered might have come from. And there, say they probably knew that there were a couple of ships that were lost in that area. So they could do a little bit of research on each of them to figure out which one it might have been, which one might have had an anchor that would be appropriate. So those are just a couple of the different ways that I think it can be used. But maritime history, I mean, to me, so historians might want to talk about learn a little bit more about the vessels that Thomas Jefferson sailed on when he went back and forth to from Philadelphia or New England to Paris and back, for example. There's before the telegraph, information that traveled a long distance traveled by ship. And so there's so many different things that are so useful that can be so interesting to learn about vessels. And my goal really is to try to make that easier. So I'm biased, but I think almost everybody can find something useful in shipindex.org.